Hey there, everybody. Eric Hurst. I'm back after a 3-week absence. The Training Cafe returns with episode number 19, coming from you from a remote location. In fact, very remote, from Pennsylvania, my home base, where the previous episodes have been hosted, to here in Colorado. Behind me, you can see the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And if you look behind that sign in that car, you just might see the Flatirons. Some wonderful climbing up there in the Flatirons. I'm here in Arvada taking a couple of rest days. We've been climbing mostly as a family. My son's kind of doing their own thing. My wife and I doing our own thing, and we've intersected a few times. And every few days, I need to rest my old body and also get caught up on work. And so I felt compelled, such a beautiful day here in Colorado, to do one of these training cafes since it's been a while. So before we get started, let's not forget, we must toast to climbing and coffee. What is better than talking about training, drinking coffee? That's what the Training Cafe is all about. So let's sip together. Komodo Dragon, my favorite Starbucks coffee. Though I prefer to brew my own coffee at home or at the campsite. But today I'm putting in some work time here at the Starbucks outside Arvada. And so I see some of you are typing in questions now, and I will get to them in just a few minutes. I hope you can hear my audio okay here at this Starbucks, where I've kind of tapped into their Wi-Fi so I can stream this episode. It's a bit noisy with cars, and perhaps you can hear the music on the intercom here playing. So it's a little bit distracting for me, but let's try to get focused here and get started. 4 things I wanted to talk about here to begin, relating to road trip climbing performance, and then I'll get to your questions. And, hopefully all of you will have a chance to go on some kind of a climbing trip this summer. Maybe it'll be a long weekend. Maybe it'll be a couple of weeks. Maybe it'll be longer than that. Every year I try to get out of town for a few weeks, kind of just to get a fresh setting and have a distant location to travel to enjoy the sport of rock climbing and to kind of recharge the batteries before I head home to work and family and all those things. It's a nice process and provides renewal going on the road for a few weeks. And if you're serious about climbing and training, as you probably are since you're watching the Training Cafe, hopefully you planned out your training heading into a road trip so that you kind of get that peaking effect. I think it was our episode 18 Training Cafe back at the end of May, where I talked about how to kind of structure your training to hit a peak as you exit and travel onto some type of a climbing trip. And if that's the case, you're probably going to arrive at your destination in peak form, super motivated, maybe jet lagged, depending where you're traveling. But that first week to 2 weeks is kind of a golden period where your motivation is high. You're, again, if you've tapered properly and kind of structured your training appropriately, you should be at a physical peak, hopefully injury-free, pain-free, and ready to strike and do some hard ascents. Now, there are some complicating factors. Like, for instance, when I travel west, I live essentially at sea level. And then if I travel out to, here in the Front Range, we're at 5,000 or 6,000 feet to climb. If you're down low, if you're up in the mountains, it could be 8,000 or 9,000 or 10,000 feet. And when I travel up into Wyoming, a place like Wild Iris or Ten Sleep, some of the best summer climbing is at 8,000 or 9,000 feet. So coming from the East Coast to performance climb at elevation is a problem, because a lot less oxygen to consume at 8,000 or 9,000 feet. And so if you're doing hard sport climbing, you will go, and I do go, anaerobic much faster. All climbers will, because there's less oxygen. And until you catch up and make enough red blood cell mass to kind of level the playing field, you will your aerobic energy system will be diminished, and therefore you will go anaerobic earlier, faster, and pump out faster than you otherwise would. And so it's tough to travel from sea level to a higher elevation location, like in Wyoming, and to really benefit that first week from your high motivation, and your peaking, your physical condition being peaked, because you're at such a disadvantage. And so a good rule of thumb is you need about 1 day per 1,000 feet in terms of making red blood cells to try to catch you up. And when your red blood cell mass increases, eventually you'll be acclimated to the new elevation and then be able to perform up to your peak. But that can take more than a week, perhaps even 2 weeks, to get fully acclimated. And then by then, maybe your motivation is dwindling, maybe your conditioning is beginning to dwindle a little bit, fatigue is set in. And so that's a tough one. It's a lot easier if you're traveling from the same elevation, from sea level to sea level, or from a higher elevation location to a similar elevation. And I'll tell you, one thing I've noticed is Colorado climbers, who live here a mile above sea level, who travel east for performance climbing, that come to the Red River Gorge, they actually have a golden period where they're essentially blood doped, because they have a high red blood cell mass living here at elevation, and then they travel to an eastern climbing area that is at sea level, or maybe 1,000 feet above sea level at the red, and they have that extra red blood cell mass for a week or two. Eventually, again, the body evens the playing field, and down regulates red blood cell production for them. But when they arrive at the Red River Gorge, they actually have extra red blood cell mass, which means they can perform higher with their aerobic energy system. And that's huge for those endurance routes at Red River Gorge. And so Colorado climbers that come into the red, if they're fit and prepared for that type of climbing, can really destroy the place their first week or two, because they're naturally blood doped. So in any case, those are some things you need to take into account. For me, coming to the West, the first couple of weeks is a bit of an adjustment period until I get used to the elevation. And then hopefully I'm still in good enough shape and still motivated to get on some hard routes. Now, another complicating factor this time around was the whole COVID-19 shutdown that we all went through. I didn't have a spring climbing season. I got to the red for a day or two in the cold rain and didn't really get much done. And I was there with the Do Hard Things guy, Hans Florine, and it was kind of a depressing couple of days. And then the whole COVID shutdown kicked in, and so I didn't have a spring climbing season. So coming out here, I spent my first week just kind of climbing a lot of 511, 512 routes to kind of get dialed back into my movement skills and be prepared, and be kind of dialed back into being an efficient climber. And so now I'm 3 weeks into the trip, taking a few rest days. Hopefully the next couple of weeks I can send some of my best routes of the trip. So we shall see. Some other things here to think about when you're on climbing trips. What should be the schedule of rest days versus climbing days? I know a lot of people, if you have a short trip, maybe just a week or two, 2 days on, 1 day off is a very common schedule to go with. But it depends on how long your days are, and what your climbing mission is. If you're going to Yosemite to do big walls, maybe you're climbing 2, 3, 4 days in a row and then resting 2 or 3 days after that. If you're going on a bouldering trip or a sport climbing trip where you're just putting in half days, you might be able to do 3.5 days in a row before you take a day off. And if you're like me, kind of on a sport climbing mission, well then maybe you're putting in 8-hour days at the crag, and you can do that 2 days in a row, and then your body and your skin needs some recovery time. And age is another factor. An older climber like me needs more recovery time than a younger climber. That's just the way it is physiologically. And of course, nutrition plays a big factor. You certainly don't want to be protein deficient nor calorie deficient when you're on a road trip. it's nice to eat lean meals and to feel light when you're on a road trip. But yet, if you're calorie deficient, which if you're camping and cooking, it's pretty easy to be calorie deficient, because you tend to, when you're camping, not make high calorie meals like you might get in a restaurant, let's say. You're not likely to be eating burgers and pizza if you're cooking your own meals at a campsite. So you tend to have um, uh, meals that aren't that large in calories. And so you integrate that over many days, and it's easy to become calorie deficient. And then that slows your recovery process and begins to hurt your performance. And of course, protein is essential for recovery of muscles and tendons. And so being sure that you're getting enough protein when you're on a road trip is very important. And again, if you're cooking simple meals, you're not likely making chicken and steak and things like that are great sources of protein. And so that's where a protein supplement can come in. And so when I'm on a climbing trip, I do have my PhysiVantage products, and I'm mixing up some supercharged collagen in the morning as a protein source to feed my tendons. And then post climbing and before bed, I have a glass of weapons grade whey protein. And that way I'm getting about 40 grams of protein per day from those beverages, from those supplements, and then maybe another 40 or 50 grams from energy bars and the various meals that I prepare, kind of targeting to get close to 100 grams of protein per day at my body size. Okay, and I guess the final thing to talk about is how long you can stay on a trip. And, of course, the dream for many climbers is the never-ending road trip. But I've never had that type of situation. I've always been a working climber, kind of a weekend warrior and a family man, and I enjoy a busy life where I, am involved in a lot of different activities, both in and outside of the climbing world. And so my trips often will be anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. In a few situations, I've gone on longer road trips. But I kind of feel that after 4 weeks, my body is running down. I am losing my performance edge. And also, I'm kind of becoming fatigued physically. There's a nervous system fatigue that accumulates over many weeks of being on a climbing trip. And mentally, if you're living out of a tent, and a number of things begin to accumulate that after a month, you're kind of ready to get home to your bed and your schedule and your everyday life, and that again can provide kind of a natural cycle where you are at home, you're back into your training mode, you're back into your routine, earning a paycheck, and then you're preparing and training for your next adventure, your next trip. And you just kind of repeat that cycle. And I'll tell you, that's what a lot of the pro climbers do. You might think that, someone like an Adam Ondra or Alex Megos is on an endless road trip, but that's definitely not the case, because training is such a big part of what it takes to be Adam Ondra, what it takes to be Alex Megos, that to stay in peak shape, and hopefully season over season get a little stronger, a little more capable, they must put their time in the gym. And so they have that natural cycle as well mapped out, where they have a trip that they go on for a few weeks or perhaps a month, and then they're back to the training grind for a few weeks or a month or two to get them back up to their next trip. I've known Alex Megos for, I guess, maybe 8 years or so, and climbed with him in Germany briefly a few times, and invited him to my home crag, the New River Gorge, a few years ago. And it was pretty interesting. When he flew in from Germany into DC, I'm like, hey, Alex, why don't you come up to my house and hang out with us for a day or two? And he politely said no, he was going to go straight to the crag. I mean, he landed at the airport at Dulles, got his rental vehicle, and he and his friends that night drove until midnight to get to the New River Gorge so that they could begin climbing immediately. Because he had obviously, as a well-coached athlete, had himself in a place to peak, and that only lasts so long. He wanted to get to the crag and benefit from that peak and climb his very best. And within a few days, he had put up 514D, which was not only the hardest route at New River Gorge, still is, but prior to him putting that route up, 514B was the hardest route. So he added 2 letters to the hardest route, the hardest grade in the area when he arrived. And it was really a jaw-dropping trip to see how fast and how hard he climbed that first week or two. And I think he stayed between the red and the new about 3 weeks, and then boom, back to Germany to rest a few days and get back to training. And so that's the type of cycle you should be thinking about, to balance out your home training, your kind of everyday life with your climbing performance. Okay, so that's about all I wanted to say. I've covered about 15 or 16 minutes. So let's answer some questions here. And I see quite a few coming in. If you have something to ask, you can type them in as well. First up, Brandon. He's a 16-year-old climber, and he says he eats only about 1,600 calories a day. I guess he's been told he should be eating more than that, and he's wondering my opinion on calories and protein consumption for him as a 16-year-old. And, I've talked about this before. It's kind of controversial. I mean, climbers don't need to eat a lot of food, nor should they really eat a lot of food. We aren't marathon runners. We aren't Tour de France cyclists. We aren't football players and soccer players who run around for an hour or two and burn 1,000 calories in an hour. Climbing, and I should specify, bouldering and sport climbing and single pitch climbing doesn't burn a lot of calories. Gym climbing for a few hours doesn't burn a lot of calories. So you can't consume 3 or 4 or 5,000 calories a day and stay light and fit and have a high strength to weight ratio. Most climbers probably do eat around 2,000 calories a day, more on active days, maybe a little less on rest days. To me, the 1,600 calories that you mentioned here, Brandon, sounds a little low to me, though maybe you only weigh 120 pounds, and that might be the right amount for you. I do not think that teenagers should diet, that is for sure. I think they should eat healthy diets and be sure they're getting lots of fruits and vegetables and enough protein. You mentioned here you get about 80 grams of protein a day, which is a decent amount. If you're training hard, climbing hard, you might want to be even closer to 100 grams of protein. But everything you're telling me sounds like you're in a pretty good place, Brandon. The protein number is, I think, the most important thing to key on, because a lot of climbers or just individuals who diet, they tend to reduce foods that, or they tend to eliminate foods that are good sources of protein, and therefore they become protein deficient, and that can result in overtraining syndrome, connective tissue injuries, and just be all around a bad thing. And so the last place you want to reduce your calories is in the protein category. Instead, cut maybe some carbs and some unhealthy fats from your diet if you want to reduce your calories some. Okay, on to the next question here from Marcel, wondering how to incorporate max weight pull-ups during the week as a weekend warrior, as a weekend climber. And yeah, that's a good question. You wouldn't want to do them on Thursday or Friday, that's for sure, because max weight pull-ups are stressful on the nervous system and take 2, maybe even 3 days to recover from, depending how many sets you're doing. I'm a big advocate of the 5 sets of 5 reps of weighted pull-ups. And so I would say if you're going to do that type of a weighted pull-up protocol, and maybe also in that same workout do weighted fingerboard hangs, you'd want to do it on a Tuesday. And then perhaps on Wednesday do more of an endurance or power endurance workout, and then Thursday and Friday rest. And then you're going to be 100% fresh to climb on Saturday and Sunday. and just repeat that cycle. Rest Monday, back to your maximum strength, weighted pull-ups, hangboards, bouldering on Tuesday, endurance on Wednesday, rest Thursday and Friday, or maybe do a little bit of antagonist work and some aerobic activity on Thursday, rest Friday, climb weekend. That's a really good schedule for most people. Okay, next up, Greg. Oh, thanks for the confirmation that the audio is working. I was a little worried about that here at this location. I don't see a question, but I appreciate the comments, Greg. And I see a bunch of other people chiming in. Appreciate the comments. Here is one from a few questions here from my buddy, Hans Florine. DHT things, do hard things. Hans, everybody knows Hans. He's legendary. He is the speed climbing guru. He's climbed the nose of El Cap over 100 times. He held the speed climbing record and lost the speed climbing record a few times over the years. Is a very motivated, driven person, about the same age as I am. And so maybe we'll have some friendly competitions here in the next few years to see what we can do here, Hans. But in any case, he's started kind of this new mission to encourage people to do hard things, to challenge themselves in their life, not just climbing, exercising. It could be in any field. There are tough things to do, challenging things to do, things that you're apprehensive about, things that you're fearful about, things that you don't think you can do, but maybe you could if you tried. And so that's kind of the philosophy behind do hard things, is you don't know until you try. And so Hans is a very inspirational person, and you can follow on Instagram the Do Hard Things Instagram page, and visit Hans's website and get involved in some of his projects. I just want to see what his questions are here. He says he's having shredded beets for breakfast with vegetables, eggs, and sausage. Wow. That's quite a meal. Not the biggest fan of the sausage there, Hans, but the eggs and the veggies and the beets, that's great. And he says he sprinkled some Endurex on top of it. So that's a novel combination. I guess a more serious question here is asking, Hans is a user and an ambassador for PhysiVantage Nutrition, and he's wondering about mixing the supercharged collagen or the whey protein into boiling water like coffee. Is there anything detrimental about that? And, it's funny. I've seen some stuff on the internet about that. People saying, well, protein gets destroyed by heat. And, if you cook a steak well done, that's not the healthiest thing to do. And it's probably not the best thing to do. But in terms of mixing collagen in beverages or protein in different meals, or even cooking with whey protein, like putting weapons grade whey in muffins, or being creative like that, there's no detrimental aspects to mixing them into warm beverages or using them in warm foods. Bone broth, cooking bone broth, that is naturally a great source of collagen. And so the collagen isn't being broken down when you cook bone broth on the stove. So why would mixing collagen in your hot coffee break it down? There's just some foolishness out there, as is the case in the internet world, where there's a lot of bad information. And the fact is that collagen powder, when it's dissolved, consumed, and digested in your digestive tract, it breaks down into the individual amino acids, just as any protein food would. Now, the one thing that can be damaged by heat is vitamin C. Supercharged collagen by PhysiVantage, we have added vitamin C to it because that is an essential cofactor for collagen synthesis, and it's what's in fact been done in the research. Our products are research-based. We try to mimic the research, the studies that have been beneficial, that have shown the benefits of collagen consumption for connective tissue health and joint health. We have designed our products based on that research. And so we've included the 50 grams of vitamin C in every serving of supercharged collagen. And vitamin C does break down when it's heated. So by dumping that into your coffee, probably a portion of that vitamin C is diminished. Just like when you cook vegetables in the stove, some of the vitamin C content is destroyed by the heat. And so that can be a problem. But again, if you're consuming other vitamin C rich foods throughout the day, there's no problem there. Okay, on to, let's see here, what Keith says, 1 day per 1,000 feet. Yeah, he's going from Fort Worth to Independence Pass, which is in Colorado outside Aspen, 12,000 feet in 30 hours. Any advice? He's going there for 5 days to boulder. So yeah, he will never, Keith, he'll never get fully acclimated. But the good news is if you're on a bouldering trip, then that aerobic energy system is not as essential as if you're on a route climbing trip. Bouldering tends to be 10 to 30 second efforts. Certainly there can be longer boulders that you'll do, but many boulder efforts are 10 to 30 second efforts, which are very anaerobic to begin with. And so you're not as penalized, let's say, by having the reduced red blood cell mass, coming from a low elevation up to Independence Pass. You're not going to be as penalized, except during your recovery periods, because all recovery is aerobic. So between boulders, I would take longer breaks than you might do at the gym or that you might do at a lower bouldering area. Make every effort count and rest more completely, maybe 5 to 10 minutes between each boulder attempt. And of course, when I travel to elevation, try to eat some iron-rich foods the first few days, or take an iron supplement the first few days. You don't need to do a lot of iron supplementing, but it would be helpful to be sure that you have some iron in your diet. Eat a few pieces of red meat on your way into Colorado, or when you get there, would be a smart thing to help the process along in terms of getting the red blood cell production going. Okay, Greg is headed to Lander, Wyoming. I was just in Lander for a few days, meeting my sons up there, and such a great town. Love Lander. Wants to know if there's a 12A that I'd recommend trying out in Lander. Well, I'll tell you, there's a lot of great 512s at Wild Iris, and you're going to find the grades stout there, no doubt about it. I think maybe the best 512A is called Wind and Rattlesnakes. It's at the main crag at Wild Iris. I believe it was put up by Amy Skinner the first year that Wild Iris was opened up in the early 90s. It is a terrific route, and you'll be huffing and puffing for air when you get on that route because it's a lot of big pools between pretty good holds, but you're at almost 9,000 feet at Wild Iris. So that is one of those areas that if you're not acclimated to the elevation, you're going to feel the difference. You're going to go anaerobic quickly. Also at the OK Corral, which is a separate cliff, there's a more vertical 12A called Diamonds and Rain. Really good route. I should know because I put it up in the early 90s. It's one of the handful of routes that I bolted at Wild Iris back in the early 90s when Todd Skinner invited some of us, some of his colleagues, peers in there to help him bolt the area. And so that's a great one as well. And there are many others. So pick up the Steve Bechtel guidebook, Lander Rock Climbs, and that is an excellent guidebook to get you to the crag. Okay, let's see here. Trying to scroll through some of these questions here. There's a few I'm going to skip over. I apologize, but might not have time to get to quite all of these. Question here about what do I think of training pull-ups on kind of a Gaston position? And that sounds a little stressful to me on your shoulders. I would rather work Gaston positions as an actual rock climbing movement on a bouldering wall or a systems wall, and make it more functional in that way. Whereas trying to mimic, doing a pull up in a Gaston position sounds potentially injurious, and maybe not even all that fun to do. So I think I would try to focus on training Gaston positions on an actual climbing wall. Yeah, Kevin here asks tips for transitioning from air conditioning to hot outside climbing. Yeah, that's a big one, and that can be a problem for folks. Your body takes time to acclimate to heat, just like it does to elevation. And something that you could potentially do if you have access to it is use a sauna every other day for a week or two before you go on your climbing trip. I have a sauna. I could actually talk more about that in a future podcast. There's numerous health benefits to having a sauna. And so I had a small sauna installed in my garage a few years ago. And it's a great tool to sit in for 30 or 40 minutes, a few days per week. And what your body does is it adjusts by making heat shock proteins. And those heat shock proteins are one of the body's ways of adjusting to heat stress. And so doing things that obviously stress your body in a similar way to what you're heading into is helpful, and hence the sauna. Or if you can exercise at the hottest time of the day, going for a run during the hottest time of the day, a few days per week, that would have a similar effect in terms of heat shock protein increase and helping prepare you. But otherwise, you just have to kind of arrive and do the best you can do to consume water and keep your body cool, and hopefully not be overwhelmed by the heat. And if it's heat and elevation, that kind of 1-2 punch can really run down your body quickly. Okay. Some other people here thanking me for coming back with the Training Cafe. So I'm happy to do it. I enjoy these things. I enjoy talking to you guys and being able to interact with climbers around the world. How cool is that we kind of share this sport that transcends all boundaries and allows us to kind of find common ground in a world that can be so divided at times. Common ground is a beautiful thing to bring people together, and climbing does bring people together. Lucas, have a home climbing wall for endurance. I'm climbing 2 sessions of 15 minutes nonstop. Yeah, I mean, doing a 15-minute nonstop burn on a home wall is really challenging. Unless you have a big home wall, that can be mentally challenging as you kind of lap around the wall and try to put in some longer climbs. That's a great way for developing that aerobic energy system. If you're doing that a couple of days per week, that is one of the, is a pretty good way with a home wall to prepare for climbing outside, rock climbing outside, and developing endurance. And I would probably add in a couple of days of running per week, because, when you're on a climbing wall, you're developing local endurance in your climbing muscles, but, your cardiovascular system, the stroke volume of your heart, your ability of your, heart-lung system to function and circulate blood and oxygen throughout your body needs to adapt as well. And so doing some running is a very helpful thing for, I think, for most climbers. And there's actually some research on that backs up my belief that running is a helpful thing. Not an excessive amount of running, but 20 to 40 minutes a few days per week can be quite helpful for route climbers. Yes, somebody asking here about the 3-2-1 plan. That's a training cycle in my Training for Climbing book where you do 3 weeks of strength, maximum strength and bouldering and real limit type training and climbing, and then you do 2 weeks of power endurance, which is more pumpy, where you get acidy and get bouldering 4x4s and 1 minute all out climbs and things like that, and then you have kind of a 1 week taper or 1 week deload and repeat the cycle. If you're doing that program, it's more for sport climbers and boulderers. The first 3 weeks are all about kind of trying to take your strength to the next level, and then the next 2 weeks kind of backfilling endurance based on that elevated level of strength, and it's quite an effective program. Okay, next up, Aspect says he did a 7B, that's 512B, in 2 sessions. What grade should I aim for as a summer project? Well, here's a rough rule of thumb, is if you can do a certain grade on average in 2 goes, let's say 12B or 7B, as Aspect mentioned here, if you double the number of goes, you can usually do the next letter. So I would think 4 goes, give or take a go, you might be able to do 7B plus. And then double that would be 8 goes, you might be able to do a 7C in 8 tries. That might be 8 tries spread over 3 or 4 days. And then to go to 7C plus 513A, you might need to double to 8 to 16 tries. So there you're getting into more of a long-term project. And so that's a very rough rule of thumb. When I go on road trips, I like to do routes fast. I don't camp under a project for weeks on end. I'm too old for that kind of thing. I like to be able to send routes in a few goes. And so my red point limit is kind of in the 13A to 13B range in a few goes. Perhaps this fall at the Red River Gorge, I'll pick out a project or two kind of at more of a home crag where I can spend some time and revisit a climb more often and invest more goes. And, maybe I can take that up another letter or two. But if you're on a road trip, I think it's important to send routes. If you're only gone for a few weeks or less, it doesn't make sense to invest all that time into one route, unless that one route is everything to you. But there's no guarantee you'll do it. And are you prepared to go home empty-handed? And when I'm on road trips, I'm not. I want to send some routes and feel good about myself. And it's a lot more fun to clip the anchors and send your project or several routes than it is to fail day after day after day. And so for pro climbers, or it's a different situation, obviously, because their job is to go out there and push the limits and to spend 90% of the time failing to, on rare occasions, do a super hard route. But I think for most climbers, you want to balance the fun with kind of the agony of failure, and you gotta win sometimes. And so I think limiting yourself to projecting a route for just a few days is probably the wise thing. And if you can't send it in, say, 6 goes or 3 days, then maybe it's time to find a different project and find something you can do or win, and then maybe circle back next season to that project. Okay. How important is posterior deltoid strength as opposed to lats and other larger back muscles? That's from Roslyn. Yeah, all these muscles around your shoulders, both anterior and posterior. Climbers don't pay much attention to them the way bodybuilders do. Bodybuilders do exercises to hit their shoulders from all different angles to kind of have this complete development, and it's for them all about cosmetics, right? For climbing, it's about being functional, climbing your best. And, when you're climbing on different angled walls, your shoulders, your scapular stabilizers, the deltoids are being used not only to help support locomotion, but posture. A big part of climbing is posture. When you're on an overhanging route, as you're twisting your body, as you're moving your arm overhead, it's a lot about these posture issues. And we tend to focus on the fatigue that occurs in our forearms when we're climbing, but all of those stabilizing and kind of postural muscles are fatiguing as well. And so I don't know that you need to do an excessive amount of training for that posterior deltoid strength, but if you are training on overhanging walls, you're naturally working that muscle group, and perhaps without even knowing it, fatiguing that muscle group. I know, at home we have a 50-degree overhanging wall, and if we're doing 1-minute circuits on there, we do kind of feel fatigue in the back of our shoulders. And so if you are doing a lot of steep wall climbing, then you're probably doing a pretty good job training those muscles, though you could do some supplemental exercises with rings or TRX trainers and such, T's, Y's, and I's. I did a video on that a couple of months ago that you might want to check out, Rosalind. Lucas, top 3 crags at the Red River Gorge. Yeah, he says Muir Valley, Bob Marley, and Motherlode. I would agree with that. Motherlode is iconic. Chocolate Factory is pretty good, right next to the Motherlode. Drive by. There's so many great crags at the Red. It's tough to pick 3. Certainly Muir Valley's got a ton of them. Okay, let's see here. Okay, Brandon is saying, can you describe what I eat in a day? Well, when we were up in the mountains, we were up in the Bighorns last week, camping at 9,000 feet and climbing at 9,000 feet. We were cooking all of our meals, and so breakfast for me, I'd roll out of bed, get the coffee brewing. I would mix up a scoop of Endurex and a scoop of supercharged collagen in water. That would be the first thing to hit my belly. Then some coffee and some oatmeal, cook some oatmeal. Then usually on the way to the crag, eat a banana. And at the crag, an energy bar midday for kind of a afternoon small meal, typically a bagel sandwich, peanut butter and jelly in a bagel. I typically will eat that at 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And often we're climbing late into the evening and not getting back to camp till 8 p.m. And then at 8 p.m., we will usually make a spinach salad or some type of salad, cook some pasta, maybe make some chili mac, stuff like that. I love pasta, and you need carbohydrates after climbing all day. And I would have usually first thing when I get back to camp after climbing is a glass of protein, either like Powerplex mixed in water or whey protein mixed in. Sometimes we have a cooler with ice that we keep skim milk in. And if so, I prefer the whey. But if we don't have the skim milk, well, then I mix the vegan Powerplex into some cold water and get that into my belly before dinner, so that there's plenty of protein available for muscle recovery. And then right before bed, have another serving of protein. The goal being 80 to 100 grams of protein per day. And calorie-wise, if we're climbing a long day, probably 2,500 calories, though that depends on your metabolism, your age, and your body mass, of course. Yeah, and Hans is saying, when are we going to meet at Omaha Beach? Well, we'll see about that, brother. That's a 14A, and I can dream. Um, I need to develop the belief that I can do that, and maybe you're the man to get me to believe in that, Hans. But there are guys, a few, very small number, who have done 14 at the advanced age of the upper 50s and even early 60s, but that's few and far between, that's for sure. So, okay, well, I've been on the air here for 45 minutes. I guess it's time to sign off. I really appreciate you guys all dialing in. It looks like we've had a good viewership here for this Training Cafe number 19. I've been so engaged talking with you that I forgot to sip my coffee here. And I am going to be heading back up to Wyoming in a couple of days after I get caught up on some work. And hopefully in another 2 weeks or so, I can try to do another Training Cafe from somewhere on the road. Maybe Lander, Wyoming. Who knows? That would be a great place. That town, I believe, has the highest per capita of trainers, climbing coaches and trainers of any town in the world, because it's a small Wyoming town of population just 5,000 or 6,000, and I think there's got to be 10 climbing coaches that live in Lander. Kind of a impressive little hub there. People like Chris Hampton of Power Company and Steve Bechtel and the folks affiliated with his training facility, Elemental, and Matt Pincus, and some of the Training Beta people. I mean, it's kind of a hub of knowledge on training for climbing. It's a pretty cool town for a number of other reasons as well. So that does it for this episode of Training Cafe. Thanks for checking in, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Bye-bye.